Hi everybody and welcome to another Real Rugby video. This week I'm trying to do the near impossible and I've decided to pick my ultimate Southern Hemisphere Dream 15. This is sort of a fantasy selection. I'm going to do the same for the Northern Hemisphere next week, and then ultimately I want to pick the greatest 15 players that I think I can put on the field. It's a bit of fun. It's always a debatable topic. I know it's very subjective. I'd love to hear feedback from everybody in the comments section on which players they think deserve a spot. I'm not just going to do these types of videos. Ultimately, I am going to do some tribute videos with some great footage on all these players over the next couple of weeks. So how I'm doing this is I'm looking at all 15 positions and I have created a short list for every single position in the team. Now, for positions like fullback, fly-off, scrum half, number 8, and hooker, I have a short list of 5 players. And for the centers, wings, flanks, locks, and props, I've created a short list of 10 players from which I would pick 2 for those positions. So let's get into it. At fullback, at number 5, I've got Chris Latham from Australia. At number 4, I've got Ben Smith from New Zealand. In third place, I've got Israel Folau from Australia. In second place, I put in Matt Burke from Australia. And the top spot has to go to Christian Cullen from New Zealand, who in my opinion is arguably the greatest fullback that has ever played the game. He's well known for his attacking brilliance. We did a fantastic tribute to Christian Cullen. Go and check out the video in the Real Rugby video section. The guy was just a freak. You know, he wasn't physically big, but he was immensely strong. He had a fantastic swerve, incredible pace, and he scored a hell of a lot of tries. On top of that, I think he had an underrated kicking game. It was something that he sort of brought to his arsenal a couple of times, the chip and chase, the long range kick. But he, for me, was just a complete player. I think together with guys like Donny Gerber, he's like the perfect prototype of what a good rugby player should be. So top spot for me has to go to Christian Cullen. Okay, moving on to the wings. In 10th spot, I picked Joe Roff from Australia. At number 9, I picked Carl du Plessis from the Springboks. At number 8, I went with Brian Williams from New Zealand. At number 7, I had to include Rupeni Thautha-Nebuka from Fiji. At number 6, I picked Jeff Wilson from the All Blacks. At number 5, I went with David Campese from Australia. At number 4, I picked Brian Abana from the Springboks. At number 3, I went with John Kerwin from the All Blacks. And at number 2, and the guy that I would pick on the right wing for my ultimate Southern Hemisphere Dream 15 is Ray Mort from South Africa. I think he's just the greatest right wing that's ever played the game. It was a very, very tough choice between him and Kerwin because they're very similar players, very big, very powerful, very fast. But I think Ray had a little bit more X factor. He wasn't just a powerful winger. He could beat you with speed on the outside like a classic wing should. And that hat trick he scored against the All Blacks in '81, a couple of tries that he scored against South America. He played for Zimbabwe, Transvaal, Northern Transvaal, scored so many tries for the unions that he represented. He will go down as one of the greatest Springboks of all time, together with Carl du Plessis and Donny Gerber. In that backline in the 80s, they were just devastating. And I think to this day, we haven't seen a better right wing in South Africa than Ray Mort. And it was a toss-up between him and Kerwin. I could have gone with Kerwin, but ultimately I picked Ray Mort. I think he was phenomenal. And he would have been great in tandem with the guy that I picked on the left wing. And my top choice for the greatest winger in the Southern Hemisphere, I had to go with John Alamu. It's not really a surprise. There's been so many great wingers over the years, but Jonah just changed the game. He was the first global superstar after the 1995 World Cup. He really broke the mold of what a winger could be and should be and how they played. I think his general skill set gets underrated. People remember him as a big physical guy that ran over opponents, but he had more to his game than that. He was defensively strong. He could do the odd chip and chase. He beat defenders on the outside more often than he actually ran over them, and obviously it was immensely difficult to bring him down. Now, there's this stupid fun trivia in South Africa, and that South Africans are very proud of, that Jonah Lomu never scored a try against the Springboks. I think it's the most useless piece of trivia, and I actually hate it when people bring it up because it means nothing. He also didn't score a try against Wales, but that doesn't take anything away from his capability or how devastating he was. He battled with illness during his career, and he could have easily played 100 tests for the All Blacks and scored many, many more tries. But if you look at his game, specifically in his younger years, he has got to go down as the greatest winger that has ever played the game. An absolute legend and giant of the game. So I'm happy to pick Ray Mort and Jonah Lomu as my wings. Looking at the centers, the midfield combination, at number 10 I had Bruce Robertson from New Zealand. At number 9, Jason Little from the Aussies. At number 8, Jacques Fourie from South Africa. At number 7, Conrad Smith from New Zealand. At number 6, I've got Jean de Villiers from the Springboks. At number 5, Tana Umaga from New Zealand. At number 4, Frank Bunce from New Zealand. At number 3, I picked Maniki Suru from the Springboks. And then at number 2, and the guy that I would put it, on the inside center is Tim Horan. I mentioned it in a previous video. I'm a big Tim Horan fan. I think he was a fantastic inside center. Very creative, great distributor of the ball, but he could also hit a gap. I think back to that 99 Rugby World Cup semi-final against the Boks, where he just decimated us in the back line, and he gained a lot of ground for Australia that day to put Matt Burke in a position to kick some penalties. So he was just a wonderful player. He was just as good in 1991, and I think he'll be remembered as one of the greatest Australian rugby players the world has ever seen. But top spot and in the outside center position, I don't think it's a surprise for the people that know me and know this channel. I had to go with Dani Gerber. For me, it's not even a debate. We put a lot of time and effort into building a very good tribute for Dani. Go and check it out. If you have any doubts on how good he was, go and look at our tribute. He was a try-scoring machine, and without a doubt, probably the most naturally gifted rugby player that I have seen play to this day. He is a phenomenal rugby player, and for me, even if I'm biased, I wouldn't have picked anybody else at 13. So Tim Horan and Dani Gerber is my dream center pairing for the Southern Hemisphere Dream 15. Now, who's going to give them the ball at fly half? In 5th position, I went with Stephen Larkham from Australia. At number 4, I went with Beauden Barrett from New Zealand. At number 3, I went with Andrew Mertens from New Zealand. At number 2, I went with my childhood hero, Naas Botha from South Africa. And in top spot, I had to pick Dan Carter. As much as I loved Naas, it was tough playing in the 80s during the isolation years. But if you look back at the 1981 tour, I think the whole world saw how good Naas was. He just didn't quite have the same opportunities as a guy as Dan Carter had. So Carter dominated the fly-off position between 2005, when he really started playing fly-off, up until his retirement from international rugby in 2015. He also ended on a high. And if I think about how good he was in that semi-final and final in 2015, for me, I had to go with Dan. I think he's a phenomenal rugby player. He seems like a very down-to-earth bloke, and I think he's one of the greatest rugby players that has ever played. Right, going to Scrum Half. The top 5 Scrum Halves, in my opinion, from the Southern Hemisphere is in 5th position, I went with Justin Marshall. At number 4, I went with George Gregan. At number 3, I went with Aaron Smith. At number 2, I went with Fourie de Preez. And in top spot, I had to go with Joost van der Westhuizen. Now again, I think a lot of people will debate on who was the better scrum half, Joost or Fourie de Preez. I think it's maybe not a fair comparison to make, because they were two completely different players. Fourie technically is probably a better scrum half. He's tactically very astute. He knows how to read the game. He had a very, very good kicking game. But Joost, I think, was an overall better rugby player. Very instinctive, liked to snipe around the fringes of the ruck. He scored some ridiculous tries out of nothing. And, scoring 38 tries out of 89 tests is unheard of for a scrum half. And again, when I think about Joost, I mentioned him in the same space as the biggest Springboks of all time, Frick de Preez, Donnie Craven, Henny Miller. Joost gets the same sort of mention in my eyes. I think he's an absolute legend. So I would love to see Joost next to Dan Carter, giving the ball to that back line. Moving into the forward pack, at number 8, the top 5 spots went to Buck Shelford at number 5. At number 4, I went with Dwayne Vermeulen. At number 3, I went with Kieran Reid. At number 2, I went with Henny Miller. from South Africa. And at top spot, I had to go with Zinzan. Again, this was very, very tough. I almost picked Henny Miller. He was a revolutionary number 8 in the 50s. For the Springboks, he really changed the way that number 8s played from the base of the scrum, because he had immense pace from the back of the scrum and really got a lot of go forward ball for the South African forwards. He was a highly successful Springbok captain as well, and probably one of the top 10 greatest Springboks of all time. But for me, growing up in the 80s and 90s and really watching Zinzan play, he really was a favorite of mine, even though he played for the All Blacks and scored some tries and drop goals against the Springboks that hurt us. But Zinzan for me again was a very, very well-rounded rugby player. His tactical awareness and his positional play, I think, was above average, actually very, very good for a forward. He seemed to always be in the right spot at the right time, which put him into that position to kick the odd drop goal or give the odd long pass like he did to Cullen in that test at Carisbrook in '97. So Zinzan for me, the complete skill set, a fantastic athlete and a wonderful rugby player. So I'm going with Zinzan at 8. Right. Finishing up the loose trio, the top 10 flankers, in my opinion, at number 10, I went with Jerry Collins. At number 9, I went with Ian Kirkpatrick, also from New Zealand. At number 8, I went with Josh Kronfeld from the All Blacks. At number 7, I went with Schalk Burger from South Africa. At number 6, I went with Jan Ellis from South Africa. At number 5, I went with Peter Steph de Toy, also a Springbok. At number 4, I went with David Pocock. At number 3, I went with George Smith. At number 2, I had to go with Michael Jones, who, looking back over the years, he was also a different type of player. He wasn't just that hard grafter that most loose forwards were up until the mid-80s. He brought an explosive running game into the mix that really differentiated New Zealand from how other teams played. And I think he was instrumental in that 1987 World Cup win for the All Blacks. He scored the first try in both the 1987 and 1991 Rugby World Cups. And for me, he was just one of the most dynamic flankers the world has ever seen. Very, very explosive, tough as nails. So, I had to pick him in my starting lineup. Now, the guy that I'm picking next to him played exactly the same position, but I couldn't leave him out, and I had to go with Richie McCaw. For some reason, maybe it's because he retired quite recently, a lot of people don't hold him in such high regard, that I've spoken to. For me, he's probably the greatest All Black that has ever pulled on that famous black jersey. Now, I know that the combination between McCaw and Jones probably doesn't make sense, but it's a fantasy team, and those are the top 2 guys in my opinion. So I'm going with Richie McCaw and Michael Jones as my 2 flankers. Looking at the lock pairing, in 10th spot, I went with Johan Claassen, the legendary Springbok captain. At number 9 is another Springbok in Mark Andrews. At number 8, I picked Ian Jones from New Zealand. At number 7, I went with Sam Whitelock from New Zealand. At number 6, I went with Bakkies Botha, the Springbok enforcer. At number 5, I went with Brodie Retallick from the All Blacks. At number 4, I went with John Eales from Australia. At number 3, I went with Frick de Preer from South Africa. At number 2, I went with Colin Meads, and this is where I have to pause because it was a toss-up between Frick de Preer and Colin Meads. In my opinion, 2 of the greatest players in that great All Black Springbok rivalry over the last century, played in similar positions, both played at lock, both played at flank at times, and they became good mates after a couple of years and after they retired. It really was a toss-up, and I felt that I had to pick either Colin Meads or Frick de Preer in the starting lineup together with a top spot. For me, again, Colin Meads just had a longer career, and I see him as probably with Richie McCaw, probably the greatest All Black of all time. Whereas Frick de Preer, as fantastic as he was, he unfortunately had to miss out on top spots. So in second place is Colin Meads, and his locking partner for me has to be Victor Matfield. I think Victor was the ultimate athlete. Again, a very, very well-rounded player, so solid from the set piece, lineouts and kickoffs. He was the best in the world, and he disrupted line-out play so much for opposition teams. When he played for South Africa, we often had the All Blacks number in a couple of facets of play, and the lineouts always seem to be one of those. So, but it wasn't just the lineouts. I think his all-round skills and capability on the field. On top of that, he was a very, very good captain and a strong leader within the South African national side. So I had to pick Victor. I think he's probably the greatest lock that's ever played the game. Right, looking at the front row at prop. At number 10, I've got Rodrigo Roncero from Argentina. At number 9, I went with a beast, Tendai Mtawarira. At number 8, the legendary Jaap Bakker. At number 7, I picked Peter Toy, also from the Springboks. At number 6, I went with Owen Franks from the All Blacks. At number 5, I went with Tony Woodcock, also from the All Blacks. At number 4, I went with Patricio Noriega, who played for both Australia and Argentina, but I picked him purely on his form for Argentina. I think he was one of the best props during the 90s. At number 3, I went with Carl Heyman. At number 2, and a tight head for my Dream 15, I went with Olo Brown. Now, when South Africa made its re-entry into World Rugby in 1992, our first game that we played was against the All Blacks, and Olo Brown was one of those guys that made an immediate impression on me, which doesn't often happen for a tight forward. It's usually the flashy backs that really make an impression on a young 10-year-old. But he was tough as nails, and he was so solid on the scrums. He really gave us a tough time that day. And you know, I really watched him during the 90s, and he dominated the majority of the contact areas, the scrums, his support play, his driving play. He had this bulldozing way of running, of just putting his head down and making the meters. I think he was Mr. Consistency, and in my opinion, one of the greatest props and one of the greatest tight heads to ever play the game. So I'm picking Olo Brown at number 2, and also packing down as my tight head next to the legend that is Oosterand from South Africa. I had to pick Oos, double World Cup winner, one of the all-time greatest Springboks, who again brought a different skill set to his play. He wasn't just a scrummager. He didn't just play in the tight. He could run, he could tackle, he could pass. He had more skills than most props did, specifically in his younger days. I think when he made his return in 2004 to the Springbok side, you know, he toned that down a little bit, and he defended and scrummed and did more what a tight forward is expected of. But when he was younger, he was exceptionally dynamic. Go and check out the tribute we did on Oos in our videos section. He scored a try for Free State against Transvaal in 1995 that most centers wouldn't score. So I had to pick Oos, and I love that front row, Oosterand and Olo Brown, who's going to pack down at hooker in between those two legendary props. At number 5, I went with Dane Coles from New Zealand. At number 4, I went with Kevin Mialamu, also from New Zealand. At number 3, I went with Bismarck du Plessis from the Springboks. In second spot, I went with Uli Schmidt, also from South Africa. And oddly enough, in top spot, I went with Sean Fitzpatrick from New Zealand. Now, as a South African, you know, I'm saying this tongue-in-cheekly because I think Sean Fitzpatrick is a great man and he was a great servant to rugby. But when he played, we loved to hate him because he just knew how to get under our skin. You know, we didn't always think that fondly of Sean Fitzpatrick. But now in hindsight, you know, more than 20 years since he retired, I can look back and say he was probably one of the best hookers that has ever played the game. And it was very tough for me not to pick Uli because Uli was a childhood hero of mine. I think he's the greatest Springbok hooker of all time. But again, you know, he suffered because of isolation. And I don't think on the world stage people saw the best of Uli, although he scored a magnificent try against the Cavaliers in '86. I had to give it to Sean Fitzpatrick, 92 tests for the All Blacks, and such a great captain for them as well. So that's it, guys. That is my ultimate Southern Hemisphere Dream 15. What do you think? Leave your comments in the comment section below. I'd love to hear back from you and hear your opinion on the players that I picked. Just to share some stats, in total I looked at 391 players, 43 from Argentina, 73 from Australia, 1 from Fiji, 139 from New Zealand, and 135 from South Africa. From that pool of players, I defined my short list of 75, and I looked at 2 Argentinians, 11 Australians, 1 Fijian, 34 from New Zealand, and 27 players from South Africa as part of my shortlist. And ultimately, my ultimate Southern Hemisphere Dream 15 consisted of 1 Australian, 9 New Zealanders, and 5 South Africans. So at least I cannot be accused of being biased because I still picked more New Zealanders than South Africans. But that is it. That is my Southern Hemisphere Dream 15. It's just my opinion. Let me know what you think. Next week we're doing the Northern Hemisphere. Thanks.